Most of us by nature are generous. We like to give to other people. We like to care for other people. We like to give people the benefit of the doubt. If we're in a generous conversation with someone where we're listening with them and giving them the benefit of the doubt and thinking good thoughts about them, we'll generally feel better about ourselves. In other words, the tendency, the natural human tendency is towards being generous. But if we perceive a lack, or if we have some kind of interior pain, we'll get more stingy. And particularly if we feel threatened, we'll get stingy. We'll get stingy in our attention, we'll get stingy in our understanding. One fascinating characteristic about borderline personality disorder, which is a disorder where people will shift from idealizing another person to seeing them as demonic. You know, their beliefs about other people are stronger than the actual experience of the other person. You know, people will learn how to do that, how to be a borderline personality disorder, if they have extreme abuse or neglect when they're small. And you can, of course, in psychotherapy and in other kinds of work, if you focus on your states of consciousness, you can learn how to be more attuned to yourself and other people and not be a borderline personality disorder. It's an eminently recoverable condition. But they were discovered to be very, very stingy in their relationships with other people. And my belief is one of the reasons that they were stingy is because they weren't really relating to other people much. They were relating to their vision of what another person was, their idealized vision, which wasn't exactly the other person, or the demonized version, which wasn't exactly the other person. We can be stingy or generous with ourselves and with other people. Now, generous is not indulgent. I am not being generous with myself if I'm saying, Keith, go ahead, hey, eat 4 donuts. Okay? That's not being generous. That's being indulgent, because I'm going to feel sick afterwards. If I do that all the time, I'm going to get real sick. I'll get diabetes. So being generous with myself around that is, all right, Keith, 1 donut will work well in this environment, and don't do the other one. Set a boundary around it, because I want you to feel better later. That's having a generous attitude towards Keith on a global sense. I can be generous or stingy with myself. Or I can make a mistake, and I can go, oh, Keith, you made such a horrible mistake. You're such a... That's being really stingy. Or I can be generous. Made a mistake, learn from it, make amends if you hurt somebody, and then grow. Get better at not making a mistake in the future. That's a generous attitude towards myself. Very similarly, couples, when they're in conflict, they get really stingy. You think about the last time that you had an argument with a lover. You're arguing with your lover. You know, if you're a woman, it's this guy, you know, he's being a jerk. If you're this guy, this woman, she's being unreasonable, whatever. Are you generously thinking, wow, they have some point that they are making that's valid? No, you're not doing that. Are you generously going, let me make sure you're heard before I tell you what I'm thinking? Now, I want you to feel heard. That's a generous position. No, you're not doing that. You know, never mind what you're saying. Listen to what I have to say. Or even more, you know, I can't no talking to you. I'm out of here. Another stingy response. Withdrawing. I'm withdrawing. I'm taking away my presence from you. Couples inevitably get stingy when they're in conflict. And so I'll be looking at a couple that they'll start getting stingy. I'll go, wow, you two are really being stingy right now. They'll get all offended. I am a generous person. I'm not being stingy. She's being stingy. I'm not being stingy. He's being stingy. Well, I really agree that she and he are being stingy, but I also think that you are being stingy. And so I'd like you to consider what it's like to feel stingy. Look at it. Well, you know, I'm tense. I'm anxious. I'm a little angry maybe. I'm seeing him or her as not very nice or good or right. Don't really think anything they have to say is good. I go, wow, sounds stingy to me. Now, a lot of times people will go, yeah, it does. I'll say, well, what would be a more generous way of being right now? And then they begin to say, well, I guess I could consider that even though I'm upset and I've been acting badly, I really want to get back to love. That's a more generous attitude towards myself. More generous attitude towards my husband is, well, maybe he has a point. This is what seems valid about your point. The more generous attitude about my wife is, I think that what you're feeling bad about is important and that we need to do something about it. Those generous attitudes evoke generous attitudes. States of mind are viral. When we look in each other's eyes, we're recapitulating. There's mirror neurons in our brains, motor neurons, that recapitulate this other person's expressions, tones, states of consciousness. If I'm stingy with you, you're likely to be stingy with me. And we'll have this complementary stingy thing going. But if I can be generous in the face of your stinginess, it puts pressure on you to be generous with me. And if you're generous with me in the face of my stinginess, there's a little bit of a disconnect. It's actually harder for one person to be generous, one person to be stingy, because there's this struggle of states. Which one is going to win? And I encourage people, choose a generous state of consciousness. A compassion towards yourself, compassion towards another person is a generous state of consciousness. That puts positive pressure on this other person to enter a generous, compassionate state themselves. I ask couples a lot to monitor whether they're being generous or stingy with each other. And when one person starts getting stingy and says, well, I'm getting stingy all of a sudden, that just breaks the ice. Often couples just start to laugh at that point. Not always, but often. And so I encourage you to go about your day noticing when you're generous and when you're stingy with yourself and with other people. When are you being generous in terms of your understanding and your care and your compassion for you? In the way that you organize what you do, your life, and so on. When are you being caring and compassionate and generous with other people? And when are you being stingy? For instance, if somebody cuts me off and I honk at them, that's not a generous response. That's a stingy response. I'm imagining that there's some kind of road maniac and not thinking maybe they were distracted, maybe they're having a bad time, maybe something else happened. I might honk. If I honk generously, it's wake up. You just did something dangerous. If I honk in a stingy fashion, it's I want to hurt you because you're bad. I have a stingy explanation for who you are. So I invite you to go about your day. Are you being generous or stingy with your partner, with your husband, your wife, your lover? Are you being generous or stingy with your kids? Are you being generous or stingy with your parents? And sometimes being generous isn't just going along when someone's being mean. Being generous is saying, you're being mean, but saying it in a compassionate fashion rather than a stingy fashion. Telling somebody to stop, you're being an asshole, stop. That's a stingy way of stopping somebody. You're getting angry and saying hurtful things to me, and I don't think you really want to do that. That's a generous way to stop somebody from being mean. So being generous isn't putting up with crap. Being generous is going through your life with compassion for other people and acting from that compassion, and with compassion for yourself and acting with compassion for yourself. We are happier when we're generous. We are less happy when we're stingy. So just notice. And it's okay if you get stingy, but notice it and see if you can adjust to being a little bit more generous, a little bit more compassionate. And notice when you're being generous and you're being a little bit more compassionate. Notice how good that feels. Stingy and generous. It's a dimension that you can look at and you can use to grow enormously and to help your family grow enormously. Because we prefer to be generous. We all basically in our heart would like to walk through the world a generous person, engaging in generous thoughts and generous acts.